Hello everybody. This is a video to introduce the players of my Dungeons & Dragons 5e, Tomb of Annihilation, Welcome to the Jungle game, to the new languages document that we'll be using for the campaign. Over the years, Dungeons & Dragons has, specifically for the Forgotten Realms, put out something in the neighborhood of 200 different languages. I think it's actually more than that. This is a look at the Forgotten Realms wiki page. These links just take you to longer lists of other languages that are based on these basic languages. So there's a lot to work with in the Forgotten Realms. I like that it is so deep and rich and well developed. There's kind of no reason, in my opinion, for me to reinvent the wheel when I like this setting so much. But managing 200 plus languages is a little more than I intended to do. So I'm not the first person to think of doing this, but I, of course, had to do it my own way. I have decided to take all of those languages and consolidate them into a single list. Not of 200 or so languages, but more like 40 or so languages, which is still a lot, in an attempt to make the world seem a little bit more rich and a little bit more realistic and a little bit more complicated than the player's handbook does, but not to get us to the point where, you know, a well-educated linguist still has no chance of really speaking to any random intelligent encounter that he has in life. So I'd like this to be something that's somewhat manageable. Again, a lot of great detail, but I didn't want to take it all on. So let me just kind of walk you through this list. I'll be sharing this list with you guys. I've got a second tab here that shows what the starting languages are for each of the PC races. I'll show that to you last. I've got this broken up into what the language is called, who speaks it, some notes about it if you're interested in all the history that goes into this, the script that it uses, and then the column that says based on in real life is meant to give you an idea of what the language is sort of sounds like, so that if you're one of those people who does great voices, you kind of know whether to adopt a Scottish accent or a French accent or an Italian accent. And it also may help you in naming your character if you want to sort of base it on that real life Earth country or setting for the language that you've selected. The first section of this document breaks down the sort of the common languages, the ones that are widespread. You'll note here that common is basically a second language for everyone on the surface of Faerun. It's the way that they communicate with each other. I borrowed an idea from Dungeons & Dragons. I didn't think of this myself, where they say that both Dwarvish and Elvish, even though they have all these dialects and all these different regional languages, they have sort of their own common so that they can interact with the other races on Toril in cases where they need to trade or there's some sort of diplomatic negotiation going on or whatever. So what we call Dwarvish and what we call Elvish are actually these common tongues that allow outsiders to interact with the dwarves and the elves in a way that doesn't offend them. You know, you want to use the language of the people you're talking to as much as you can. And then when we get down into the racial languages later in the document, you'll see that the elves and the dwarves have a more complicated tongue that they speak amongst themselves or that very educated outsiders learn so that they can speak to elves and dwarves, you know, in a higher form of their language. The rest here is sort of self-explanatory. You will see that I occasionally do give a nod to some of the other continents on Toril. So even though the game is basically set in Faerun, there are 3 or 4 or 5 other continents on the planet with intelligent people there who have their own languages. I have really, really consolidated those languages so that if you feel like you really need to be able to speak to someone from Karatur, then you're probably going to learn Trade Tongue, or you're going to learn Shao. You'll see that later in the list. But I'm not even attempting to deal with the 40 different regions on those continents the way I have with Faerun. So speaking of that, let's move on down here to the regional languages. again, Dungeons and Dragons does a great job of creating all these languages for all the different regions of Faerun, and they also very wisely and very realistically make it so that the languages don't stop at national borders, right? So if two regions are close to each other, people along the border might speak one or the other or both languages. I love that kind of realism. I think that's great, but I didn't attempt to incorporate it in this list. For my purposes, these languages basically do stop at national borders, at least for the for the purpose of selecting these languages. So what you can do is go through this list, figure out where you're from, and then you'll know what that primary tongue that you probably grew up speaking is. For instance, if you're from Waterdeep, it's Aluskan. If you're from, Chult, it's Chultan. If you're from the Dragon Coast, it's Gondathian, and so on like that. You got Tether and Amen. I think I accounted for most of the regions, but you guys will certainly come up with some place that I overlooked. If that's the case, just either pick a place here that's really close or point it out to me, and I'll assign a language to it. There are racial languages here too. This is what we, typically would call like monster languages or whatever. This includes, orcs and gnomes and gnolls and grung and fae, and I'm sure that there are races that I've overlooked that'll get added to this document over time. But for now, these are the ones that we deal with the most and the ones that came to mind as I built the list. You'll see in here that the more complicated forms of the Dwarven language and the Elven language that I was talking about a minute ago are listed here. So for the Dwarves, it's Dethic, sometimes called Durin, and for the Elves, it's Espruar. And again, there's all these links in here that take you to a Forgotten Realms wiki page about the particular language or the language group that I'm sort of consolidating into a single language. And over on the right, there's also some links that'll help you out if you're interested in learning, more about the French language. There's a link there. Moving on, we've got extraplanar languages. You guys know what that represents. There's some descriptions here of where these came from and who knows them and who speaks them and that sort of thing. Lastly, there are secret and dead languages listed here. These typically aren't available to player characters, but if you happen to be a linguist or if you've got a really cool backstory that justifies it, then I will talk to you about how you might have learned this. Certainly, rogues learn Thieves' Cant and druids learn Druidic. Drow could easily know Drow sign language and so on like that. But for the majority of the world, these are languages that they can't speak and they probably don't even know exist. So moving on to the second and last tab here, this takes all of the starting PC race options that are available in my game anyway, and shows you what their starting languages are. A few things that I've done is if you have a positive intelligence modifier at the start of the game, you'll get bonus languages for that. You don't lose any if you have a negative, and obviously you don't get any if you have no modifier at all. Also, if you happen to take the linguist feat, you can learn 5 languages instead of 3 with it, since I've added so many languages. And linguists can freely select from the secret and dead language list if that's their thing. So this is pretty straightforward. You find your race on here. If you start as an elf, then you speak Common, Elvish, and Espruar. You get a regional language and then +1 additional language per your intelligence modifier. I've got a note up here at the top that if for some reason it doesn't make sense in your head for your character to know a regional language, maybe you're a barbarian who grew up on the, in the far reaches of some mountain range and you just never came into town and learned the regional language, but there are a lot of giants in the area, then maybe you know giant, but you don't know Aluskan. I'm fine with that. You might want to talk to me about it and just make sure we agree that it makes sense for your backstory. But I get that you might want to swap the regional language for a racial language, and that's fine with me if it makes sense for your character. That's basically the whole chart. Hopefully you guys find this useful. I think it's pretty cool. It was just a pet project that I've been working on for literally a couple of years now. And I finally decided just to go ahead and finish it up since we were all working on redoing our characters anyway. So thank you very much for watching the video, and I imagine there will be more to come.